Today we're going to be talking about carbohydrate intake, specifically for fueling performance. To begin, we should probably get a general overview of what a carbohydrate is and what its function is within our body. So a carbohydrate is one of these three big macronutrients that we all tend to think of. You have your carbohydrates, you have your proteins, and you have your fats. Each has its own different function within our body. A carbohydrate simply provides energy to our bodies. Now, this energy can be used during athletic bouts or simply just a daily activity task. So even if you're stocking shelves at a night shift at a grocery store, when you're squatting down, picking up the whatever item it may be and placing it, or going for a run, going to the gym, performing a sport, whether it's soccer, hockey, football, whatever it may be, these carbohydrates are going to fuel you while you perform these tasks. So, time of consumption. When should athletes consume carbohydrates? There are multiple stages in which carbohydrate loading should take place for athletic performance, meaning there are different stages in which carbohydrates should be consumed to maximize your athletic performance. Each stage has been identified as 4 hours pre-competition, 2 to 3 hours pre-competition, during competition, and post-competition. Now, to assess the carbohydrate intake for each stage, there are two primary methods. There is the dietary recall and the food diary, which we will get into later. As of now, the main understanding is that there are 4 different stages in which the assessment of carbohydrate intake is to be assessed for maximal performance. So, assessment. How much is needed when consuming in what stage? Assessing the amount of carbohydrates needed is dependent upon the athlete's current food intake, meaning if an athlete has already consumed a major amount of carbohydrates, that will alter the guidelines somewhat of what athletes should be consuming within that range of carbohydrate intake for each stage. Again, a food diary or dietary recall would be the appropriate method. Each method has its obviously pros and cons, which we will get into later. Now, when consuming carbohydrates in each phase, athletes will be able to see if they meet guidelines of the previous stage dependent upon their assessment of their carbohydrate intake throughout the day before the competition took place. So, consumption phase, 4 hours pre-competition. This stage of carbohydrate loading has guidelines in which athletes should follow for best performance, which we have just discussed. So this stage suggests 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per pound of body weight should be consumed if athletes are consuming in this stage. So 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. So if I'm 175 pounds, I want 1.5 grams times 175, and that'll give us the carbohydrate intake for 4 hours before competition for maximal performance. When it comes to consuming these carbohydrates, because we are so close to competition, we do not want to try foods that our body are not familiar with. And do not try any foods that could cause gastrointestinal distress. So don't add any new sources of carbohydrates that your body hasn't normally been consuming during the training phase leading up to this competition or game. This could obviously cause your stomach to have a different reaction to this food because it is newly introduced to the system, and cause gastrointestinal distress, which of course will just minimize your performance because your stomach is not feeling obviously great. So consumption phase 2, 2 to 3 hours pre-competition. This phase of pre-competition is still within a time frame in which the body can digest carbohydrates the athlete consumes. So in this phase of pre-competition, solid foods are still able to be consumed because this 2 to 3 hour time frame will allow your body to digest this food and actually use these carbohydrates as a fuel source. So, if your consumption of 1.5 grams per pound of body weight was met, the athlete has reached carbohydrate intake for optimal performance. Meaning, this phase is only required if the athlete has not consumed that 1.5 grams per pound of body weight 4 hours before competition. If that has not been met, which will be based upon the assessment of the dietary recall or the food diary, in which we will be able to recognize if the athlete has not consumed that guideline, then we will understand that 1.5 grams per pound of body weight has not been met, and the athlete will take in food sources that are, again, familiar to the body and will allow them to reach that 1.5 grams per pound of body weight pre-competition. This phase is not entirely necessary. It is completely based upon the assessment of carbohydrate intake within that 4 hours and of the overall day itself. So, consumption phase during competition. This phase should follow simple guidelines to continue to enhance your performance. So, at this point, whatever you consume throughout your day is going to, again, allow for your body to perform at its maximal ability. Do not consume solid foods due to possible gastrointestinal stress while competing. So obviously, of course, you're not going to be consuming food most likely if you are in the middle of a bout or in the middle of a sport or contest. At least that'd be my assumption. So rather consume 6 to 12 ounces of a sports drink with 6 to 8% carbohydrate concentration every 15 to 30 minutes. So of course, if you are playing a sport which allows you to have a break, or in which there is timeouts, or a period in which you are not performing and allows you to have this sports drink with that said concentration every 15 to 30 minutes, this will only continue to enhance performance, meaning that it will allow your body to not become fatigued so rapidly, and you will continue being able to perform at your best with this drink of 6 to 8% concentration. Just as a little guideline, 1 gulp of this drink is roughly 2 ounces. So of course you're not going to be able to exactly measure how much you are eating or drinking rather. So 1 gulp is about 2 ounces. So 3 gulps will reach that minimum of 6, and that 6 gulps will reach that maximum of 12, okay? So consumption phase, post-competition. This phase is crucial for athlete performance in their career. So this is not only integral for refueling, but also for continuing maximal performance in the future. This phase should include a consumption of 1 to 1.2 grams per carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So 1 kilogram is relative to 2.2 pounds, okay? So take your body weight, divide it by 2.2, and that'll get your weight in kilograms, and then now 1 to 1.2 grams times your weight in kilograms, okay? So it's not pounds, it's kilograms. If you cannot consume solid food within 15 to 30 minutes, a sports drink following the same guidelines during the competition phase should be consumed. So again, 6 to 12 ounces, 6 to 8% carbohydrate concentration, every 15 to 30 minutes. Now, the reason this phase is so crucial is you're going to have adaptations occurring to your body after competition. And again, the assessment of these carbohydrate intake will, again, be using the same 2 methods, the dietary recall and the food diary, as these will be the most optimal ways to assess carbohydrate intake, and the only 2 carbohydrate intake assessments that I have found in my research. So, carbohydrate intake is not one size fits all. There are different sports that play at different intensities. So, sports such as a long sprint or something that's relatively low intensity, such as golf, or something along those lines that are not high in intensity, should be consuming carbohydrates at 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this assessment will take place upon your assessment of intensity, and again, the assessment of what you've taken in overall throughout the day, and you will assess if you've reached that minimum of 3 grams per kilogram of body weight and the maximum of 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. So, as intensity will increase for higher intensity athletics, carbohydrate consumption will increase to 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight. And again, this assessment will take place using that dietary recall or food diary to ensure that the athlete is reaching that minimum of 7 and minimum of 5 and maximum of 7. And this will, again, take place using those 2 methods. So carbohydrate consumption for competitive intensity athletics. So this intensity is rather high and could be at a moderate duration or in quick duration. So these athletes should be consuming 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. Again, the assessment methods will be as what we've discussed so far. Those are the only two methods to assess carbohydrate intake properly for athletics. So lastly, carbohydrate consumption for high intensity athletics. These high intensity athletics are often considered elite athletes. The consumption of carbohydrate becomes an outstanding 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. So this is obviously very, very high carbohydrate consumption, though the intensity, duration, and other factors for not only the competition phase but the training of these athletes will require a much higher carbohydrate intake to ensure that performance is maximal. And again, this assessment will take place not only upon the assessment of their sport and intensity, but also will take place using the dietary recall and food diary methods to ensure the athlete is reaching these requirements. So, overall carbohydrate assessment. The assessment strategies used to implement these carbohydrate guidelines are quite simple. An athlete or nutrition coach can perform these assessments with ease. So you do not need a nutrition coach to understand how much carbohydrate you should be intaking or how much you should be intaking during each phase. It comes down to following these simple guidelines, using this dietary recall or food diary to track and understand what you've had, and then use obviously these methods that you just assessed your carbohydrate intake to understand how much you need to eat, if you've met your goal, and so forth. So again, the coach or athlete will utilize either dietary recall or food diary to assess current consumption, how much you should consume, and then on competition day, assessing the consumption for each phase depending on the assessment of what you've eaten in that day. So, carbohydrate assessment, dietary recall. We've talked about the two methods. Now it's time to understand what these methods are and their pros and cons of each. The use of the dietary recall is not highly used due to its large margin of error. Factors of error could not be fully remembering what the athlete has consumed. Maybe they don't remember that they had half portion of oatmeal 12 hours ago, or they're not recalling the exact portions of which they consume. So this margin of error heavily relies upon memory. And if athletes are unsure what they ate, how much they ate, it'll make things very difficult to understand if they're even reaching the minimum amount of carbohydrate intake for maximum performance, or heck, if they're exceeding it and they're taking in too much based upon the intensity at which they are training and competing at. But if the recall is exact with what the athlete has consumed, so this information is spot on, they know exactly what they've eaten, how much, through their memory, which would be very obviously hard to do, but if so, they'll be able to use this information to understand how much they've eaten and then understand how much they need to consume. So finally, carbohydrate assessment, the food diary method. This method is preferred method for carbohydrate assessment and performance. This method does require high literacy and diligence with tracking food consumption, though its benefits are huge. So with this method, you are going to track and either write down or track in a food application. This could be a coach or athlete, what you have consumed, when you consumed it, how much you consumed. This method will allow for exact understanding of what the athlete has consumed, when, how much, and so on. This will provide them with an exact understanding of what their body has in their system and how much their body needs to consume, whether it's on a training day or a competition day. And this will obviously maximize their performance as they're 100% knowing they're reaching the minimum or they're at that maximum for the guidelines depending on their sport's intensity. This method is definitely preferred, and again, this could be used by athletes or coaches alike. It does not require a specialized nutrition coach. Again, you simply need to follow the guidelines, use this application and track what you eat. It may be slightly time consuming, but in the end, for maximal performance, this assessment of carbohydrate intake will be crucial for maximal performance, as you know exactly what is in your body and how to continue eating properly for performance. So to conclude, carbohydrate assessment takes place within two primary methods: food diary, which is preferred, and the dietary recall. Phases of carbohydrate assessment will each contain a guideline of consumption dependent upon the assessment of what they've eaten throughout the day. So of course, if you've already eaten close to that 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight coming up to competition, then your need for 1.5 grams per pound of body weight 4 hours after competition will not be 1.5, but maybe around 1 or something less, because you've already consumed close to your maximal for your daily intake. And again, carbohydrate intake varies among different types of athletics. Each athletic has a different intensity, different duration, all other factors that will vary in how much you should be eating. And that's why there is a general guideline of 1.2 to 1.5 or something thereof for each phase. And then it's upon assessing also the intensity of your sport and the duration to fully understand how much you should be taking in. Here's your citations and sources. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you got